tonight we are kicking off a new series of programming called Gymnasium, and we're featuring our guest, Professor Julian Chambliss from English. He's Professor of English and the Val Berryman Curator of History at the MSU Museum here at Michigan State University. He's a core participant in the MSU College of Arts and Letters Consortium for Critical Diversity in the Digital Age research. His research interests focus on race, identity, and power in real and imagined urban spaces. His recent writing has appeared in Frieze, Rhetoric Review, and Boston Review. An interdisciplinary scholar, he has designed museum exhibitions, curated art shows, and created public history projects that trace community, identity, and power in the United States. If you're curious about what Gymnasium does, it is a platform for MSU researchers to share and develop emerging research in conversation with the exhibitions here at the Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum. The series features a diverse scholarly response to the questions prompted by the exhibitions and is guided by an experimental and collaborative learning process. So this particular Gymnasium tonight, we're going to hear from Julian about archiving the city in comics in a short form talk. Then we have some activities in the galleries for you to do. We have instructions on the backside of your program, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that. And then you can return around 7:20ish or so, because that's when the free coffee will be out in the Starbucks for a little bit of making here at our making stations. So that's the plan for the evening. Thanks for being with us, and I will turn it over to Julian.
So you can hear me, right? I don't need right. I'm not sure that thing's on. It is, but I'm gonna start with like something dramatic.
In this comic book is a love story. A boy and girl in love. They get married, and after an offensively lurid description, illustrated of course, of the couple's wedding night, the book shows how the bride murders her husband by chopping his head off with an axe. This comic book describes a sexual aberration so shocking that I couldn't mention even the scientific term on television. I think there ought to be a law against them. Tonight I'm going to show you why.
Okay, I just want you to know we're not going to touch on any of that. I just want to get you into the mood to think about comics a little bit different way. That talk is a totally different talk. There's a whole world of comics, of course, that we could be talking about. And I always tell my students, if you really love a particular kind of comic, particular kind of story, I'm sorry, we're not going to talk enough about that, right? If you hate comics, you despise them, and you wish that they would wipe from existence, I'm sorry, we're going to talk enough about them that you're going to be upset. There's always going to be like a little bit of dissatisfaction with any presentation that I give, and I just want to acknowledge that at the beginning, not because I'm a bad person, but because comics are complicated, and I want to acknowledge that fact. This is actually an image from a class that I just recently taught, and it gets at, I think, an idea about comics that I often want to position people to understand that comics are a really complicated medium, and in fact, the form itself lends itself towards questions of complexity around not just simply content, but also how we cognitively engage with space and place. So I want to talk a little bit about form at the very beginning, because I want us to think about comics in a more complicated way. So this is a comic that you probably never heard of. Again, it's always a question about how much you read comics, but it's written by Warren Ellis and J.H. Williams. J.H. Williams, of course, very well known for his work with Batwoman, which is a character that's gotten a lot of attention recently. Warren Ellis, of course, a futurist science fiction writer, comics writer, well known for his reimagining. So this is actually the first page of a comic he did in the 90s called Desolation Jones. And what I like to point out to students is that when you look at this page, the anxiety of modern comics comes to the fore, right? So one of the things that a lot of people have struggled with is, how do you read a modern comic, right? Like, the form itself has evolved over decades with multiple collaborators, multiple influences, a real sort of space of uncertainty in terms of like reading. So the standard comic book form is there, but it's buried. So if you sort of strip away the sort of high tech, you can see that the story, the tale of this on this page is really there in the panels, but what they're actually doing is like there's a multi-layered narrative. Like they're actually driving around, and then buried within the panel is actually a page that's showing you a map of the city that they're driving around through. So like as you're reading, you're getting both a spatial narrative and a textual narrative, right? A cognitive engagement that's unique to the comic form. So comics are all about meaning, but they operate on multiple levels. And of course, one of the most well-known sort of works on comic scholarship is Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. And his is a graphic theoretical narrative, right? Like he drew it as a way to explain comics and really to tell the reader how complicated comics are. And one of the great points he makes in here is that the art form, the medium, is really a vessel, right? And you have to understand that comics can tell many different kinds of stories, even if the narrative that we have in terms of a kind of juvenile connection to comics is a sort of popular story, right? It's a medium that can tell any story. And really, that point is one of the things that makes it so powerful. It's a medium that can tell any story. And the narrative, the cultural narrative we have around comics are really built on a very kind of truncated sense of it's a juvenile form. An idea that only really exists in the American context, nowhere else. Everywhere else, comics are like books. So they're comics for kids and they're comics for adults, right? But comics are also a really sophisticated space where questions of time and space are playing themselves out. And I always like to get our students to think through the evolution of this question of time on the comic page. And you hear, again, you can see this. This is a comic page by Jack Kirby, Captain America, it's early 1960s. This is a sort of moment-to-moment kind of action sequence, a very standardized comic page. So when you're reading this page, it's very easy for you to follow the action. That standardized 6-panel grid is really the baseline for comics for a lot of people. Very quickly, within just a few years, Jim Storico, the second page, starts to introduce a kind of a graphic design element to comics. And here, the moment-to-moment line that's so clear in the first panel sort of disappears, and you become a little bit confused as to where, when, and how action is happening. Although, through close-ups and spacing and the word balloons, you understand that this is both a simultaneous action and a consequential action being played out on the page. And then, still later on in the 2000s, very famously, Marvel retold the Spider-Man story in a new imprint. And here, a manga-inspired artist, someone who really was a huge fan of manga, is drawing Spider-Man and telling the story. And this is perhaps one of the more sophisticated and frustrating pages because what's happening when isn't super clear, right? Like, and in fact, I often have a little argument with students. The students argue like, okay, is this the first panel, and then this panel, or is it this panel, then this panel? Like, what's going on? The action there is complicated. So time, space, play themselves out on the comic page, and we all have to process that using both the text and the images to achieve some understanding. 9 times out of 10, your brain's able to make this process work for you, right? It's a really poorly designed comic page and a really poor creative team that gets you lost. And what every comic book creative team wants is for you to be able to follow the story. So the visuals in comics are also a part of the story, but they're a very particular part of the story. And so there's this set of tensions in comics where I often like to think about the tension between content and context. And that's very important in terms of like understanding comics as a tool of modernity. So I have an exhibit up over at the MSU library that's actually called Comics in the City. And in that exhibit, I really try to make the point, working with my collaborator, Zach Cruzy, that comics are actually urban history, that they're an artifact and archive of the American experience, right? So when you look at comics, you could at some level take their history to be an evolution of the American experience. And Ian Gordon, the very well-known comic scholar, talks about comics as a catalog of modernity, both as a place where ideas about the modern city and the modern society in the United States are playing themselves out and being documented, but also a place where ideas about modernity can be, at some level, coped with, right? There are humor-based response, in particular, to the changes associated with the rise of the modern urban city. So when you see images on a comic page, that's both a way for the reader to understand sort of emerging trends into consumerism, new people and new practices that are coming to sort of dominate the American experience, but also a way for them to, at some level, identify the things that they want to consume, right? The visual culture around consumption playing themselves out in comic form. So, but there's also a tension here with the sort of social story of comics, right? And so when we think about comics as a genre, and particularly when I think about it, there's a number of social evolutions that are playing themselves out, both in first being presented in the comic pages, but also in the relationships that sort of define the stories within comic books. So comics are a complicated space to tell complicated stories. And I often think about this because as the comic is archived and it's penetrated into our sort of cultural milieu, like we all know comics even if we don't read them. And it's often important to recognize that fact. I often talk to students about comic book characters, and even though they've never read some of the more well-known comic book characters and consumer characters, like a Batman, they played a game, they watched the movie, they've done something in terms of consumer culture, so they know the cultural story. They know the origin story of Batman, they know the origin story of Superman and Spider-Man, and so on and so forth. So that archive of culture represented by those stories becomes an archive that they can reference around particular sets of beliefs. And so this idea that the museum is an archive, that it too provides a kind of context to understand a series of beliefs, a series of processes, a series of structures, is one way that I think comics and the sort of visual culture in museums sort of act in concert, right? The organizational structure of these two things are something that we can reference over and over again. So the idea here, I think at some level, is to think about modernity as a process that's being cataloged through media. In the case of comics, that modernity has lots of different variations that can be traced very particularly through different genres, through different characters, through different creators, through different forms, right? The mini comic, sort of like the floppy, the sort of superhero comic, the alternative comic that comes into the fore later in the process. And in that way, we could think about these archives of American experience as something being accessible and referential, and something that brings together multiple strands of the American experience, much like a museum, right? So I think the goal of the Gymnasium and the goal of comics, oddly enough, intersect. And the trick, I think, for us is to think about what can you see and what can you say in the context of making, right? I know for me, one of the things that's often a critical sort of like goal for my students is to embark on a critical and creative exercise where they're thinking about the things that they're making as an expression of thoughts that they've had about society, right? So I hope that you can think about the process that you want to undertake here tonight as being part of that kind of process. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie, and she's going to sort of lay out the groundwork for what you're going to do. Right?
So on the back side of your program, there are some instructions for the making activity this evening. I'm just going to give you a brief overview and then hand the specifics over to Britta Ernest, who is our in-process studio educator at the Art Lab. She is in charge of our making programming here at the Broad and is going to help be on hand for your making activities. Tonight we're going to go upstairs into the upper level galleries and also the ground floor as artist process gallery. You're going to find images of cities, loosely or more literally interpreted. You can collect those images, bring them back here for some making activities. And I'll let Britta tell you a little bit more about zine making, about the instructions in front of you, and to answer any questions you might have before we set you loose.
Thank you. So this is a fun thing. I think it's you can do a bit of a scavenger hunt in the museum. So we invite you to collect some materials on your way to the galleries. We have clipboards in that milk crate over there. Also these small sort of booklets that you can collect, either images, writings. I had a really fun time just going through and either reading labels or text that's in pieces and kind of picking up quotes and kind of making impromptu poetry. That was then the basis for my drawings and zines. But the basis too can be what you're collecting in there. We have pieces that come from situation, or do we have images from situations?
We have images from situations from Never Spoken Again, which is the upper level galleries, and then also we have people down here images from our collections.
Yeah, like the Stieglitz. Yeah. So all of this is available as things to remix if they're sort of quotations of the city, landmarks, landscape. And I think a really cool challenge is to think about the things Julian brought up of flexing around with format and time and narrative, that it doesn't have to be this wonderfully well-constructed story beginning to end, but maybe where it can reflect the ways that you're observing a museum exhibition that maybe jump around in terms of time, or the things that you're seeing are different formats that you see too. So spend some time in the galleries, grab a booklet and a clipboard and pencil to take notes, and then also collect your materials. Spend time looking at the exhibitions and reading a bit too. I really like that part of giving context to these snippets of things you're collecting. Then round back here, we'll have coffee and tea, decaf available, I hope. It's late for me, but it's about 7:20. And then come back and we can start making and collecting and copying and pasting what you find here into little zine booklets to make your own story.